On January 25, 2009, John Macarthur made some memorable disclosures to his church congregation. During a question-and-answer session, John Macarthur stated that he was at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis on the day Martin Luther King was assassinated. He also stated that he was at the motel that day, with two other men, Charles Evers and John Perkins. Macarthur stated that while at the motel, they all saw the blood of Martin Luther King.
We went to the motel, up to the landing, saw the blood where Martin Luther King had been shot just hours before by James Earl Ray. And I was there at that very, very, very crucial time.
John Macarthur was at the Lorraine Motel on that fateful day with Charles Evers. Who was Charles Evers? Macarthur acknowledges that Charles Evers was the brother of Medgar Evers, the first civil rights martyr.
Charles Evers had a brother named Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was the first martyr of the civil rights movement. He was the first person killed.
The FBI once accused Charles Evers of killing his brother, Medgar. Charles Evers said in his biography, "Have no fear, the Charles Evers story," that the FBI had accused him of killing his brother, Medgar. According to Charles Evers, quote, "A few days after Medgar died, 2 FBI agents came around to question me. Those FBI agents strolled into my office and said they had reason to think I'd killed Medgar." What else is known about this man, who was with John Macarthur at the Lorraine Motel? According to Wiki, Charles Evers worked for the Chicago Mafia. Wiki said, quote, "Evers left town and moved to Chicago where he fell into a life of hustling, running numbers for organized crime, and managing prostitutes." Charles Evers was also a government informant. According to a report called The Secrets of Mississippi, between 1956 and 1973, there was a secret spy agency that had been set up by the state legislature of Mississippi called the State Sovereignty Commission. Its members infiltrated the civil rights movement to inform on workers and to sow discord. Charles Evers was implicated in this operation as an informant. The report stated, quote, "Despite his high-profile work during the civil rights era, and despite his slain brother's martyr status, Charles Evers faces accusations of having been in league with the Sovereignty Commission." Evers has a long file, more than 1,000 pages. It attests to a double relationship. Charles Evers was also a friend of Nelson Rockefeller. According to Have No Fear, the Charles Evers story, Charles Evers said, quote, "Around 1955, I met Nelson Rockefeller. I'd heard Nelson himself was a special friend of the Negro. I knew once I was in, he'd like me and he did. I made myself an informal advisor to Nelson. We weren't close friends, most years we only spoke about 4 times a year. Did Charles Evers really advise Nelson Rockefeller? Or did Rockefeller advise Evers, and bankroll his activities?" John Macarthur has stated that Charles Evers was with him, at the Lorraine Motel, on the day Martin Luther King was assassinated. Most incredibly, Charles Evers has stated that 2 months later, on June 5, 1968, he was standing just 5 feet from Bobby Kennedy, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, when Senator Kennedy was shot. According to Have No Fear, the Charles Evers story, on pages 229 and 230, Charles Evers admitted, quote, "I was 5 feet from Bobby when he stopped, shook hands with 2 Mexican kitchen workers. I moved to leave, caught Bobby's eye, and waved my hand, signaling that I'd catch up to him later. That same second, I heard a loud bang bang bang. So Senator Kennedy was fired upon, at the very second Charles Evers waved goodbye to him. At this time, the viewer should be reminded that Charles Evers worked for the Chicago Mafia, as Bobby Kennedy worked to eradicate it. In a memo to his brother, President John Kennedy, dated January 10, 1963, Attorney General Robert Kennedy reported, quote, "Dear Mr. President, the administration during 1962 greatly expanded its coordinated drive against organized crime and racketeering." So according to John Macarthur, Charles Evers was with him at the Lorraine Motel on the day Martin Luther King was shot. And according to his own testimony, he was at the Ambassador Hotel when Bobby Kennedy was shot. And standing just 5 feet away. John Macarthur saw Martin Luther King's blood at the Lorraine Motel that day, with 2 other men, Charles Evers and John Perkins.
We went to the motel, up to the landing, saw the blood where Martin Luther King had been shot just hours before by James Earl Ray.
What have we learned about Charles Evers? In addition to being at the Lorraine Motel with John Macarthur, he worked for the Chicago Mafia, was accused by the FBI of killing his brother, was friends with Nelson Rockefeller, was a government spy, and was standing just 5 feet from Bobby Kennedy when he was shot. We know that John Perkins was at the Lorraine Motel with John Macarthur. What else do we know about him? Among many particulars, in 1962, John Perkins named his ministry, The Voice of Calvary, after John Macarthur's father's radio program. Perkins was a Ford Foundation Fellow, supported by the Ford Foundation. In 1991, his ministry received a point of light from the then President, George Herbert Walker Bush. Of great interest, he co-wrote a book with Tom Terrence, called, He's My Brother. As we know, John Macarthur and John Perkins were together at the Lorraine Motel. On that same fateful day, others have also placed Tom Terrence at the motel. In 1968, Tom Terrence had a partner named Kathy Ainsworth. It's been alleged that they were accomplices in the assassinations of both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. According to a blog called the White Information Network, quote, "In the King assassination, the mother of Kathy Ainsworth said her daughter and Terrence were in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968, the day King was shot, and played a role in jamming police communications." 2 months later, Tom Terrence and Kathy Ainsworth were at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Evidence is that Ainsworth was the girl in the polka dot dress. John Perkins and Tom Terrence wrote a book about their brotherhood. What is their common ground? At the least, they were both present with John Macarthur at the Lorraine Motel on the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. The official account of the Robert Kennedy assassination identifies Sirhan Sirhan as the lone nut gunman. Yet it's been proven that more than one gun was fired at Robert Kennedy that day in the Ambassador Hotel pantry. Sirhan Sirhan couldn't have been a lone gunman, since bullets fired from more than one gun were recovered from the hotel pantry that day. How was the ballistics evidence falsified, so that Sirhan Sirhan could be pinned as the lone nut shooter of Bobby Kennedy? The evidence was falsified by an LAPD criminalist, Dwayne Wolfer. One article titled, "The Assassination of Robert Kennedy," said, quote, "It looks like the LAPD ignored evidence of a second gunman, and many including the head of the Los Angeles Crime Laboratory, Dwayne Wolfer, presented false and misleading evidence to support their ballistics testimony that Sirhan was the only gunman. It's become clear that Dwayne Wolfer was also an accomplice in the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Now that we've learned who Dwayne Wolfer was, we need to learn who his son is. Dwayne Wolfer's son is Dwayne Wolfer Jr. Dwayne Wolfer Jr. was also a police officer, and incredibly, Wolfer worked as John Macarthur's bodyguard, and as a men's discussion leader, at John Macarthur's Grace Community Church. This is Dwayne Wolfer's picture on John Macarthur's church website. This is his picture enlarged. Notice his name, Dwayne Wolfer, at the top, and John Macarthur's church address, at the bottom, which reads, 13248 Roscoe Boulevard, Sun Valley, California. On a final note, what happened to John Macarthur and friends once they returned from the Lorraine Motel?
Make a long story short, when we went back and endeavored to continue to do what we were doing, we were driving down a country road headed to one of the high school meetings, and we were arrested and taken to the jail and accused of fomenting trouble and all of that.
As we just heard, their trip from the Lorraine Motel ended in their arrest for, quote, fomenting trouble. John Macarthur's arrest is known, and the record of his arrest remains unavailable, as Macarthur's Minister of Propaganda, Phil Johnson, continues to advance the deceit that John Macarthur was arrested that day for merely preaching the gospel. Given that John Macarthur is surely an agent for Satan, can it be of any surprise that Phil Johnson is seen here flashing the devil's horns? And can it be of any surprise that world-famous ministers are satanic, given the warnings in God's Word? For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works.